Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this CRMG and Collier Bristow webinar, which we've entitled Insecurity and Uncertainty, Data Security and Compliance for SMEs in a Remote Working Environment. We've got some fantastic speakers with us today who I'll introduce shortly, but I'm Simon Lacey. I'm a principal consultant with CRMG with 20 years experience within information security, including within the NHS and latterly in the Bank of England. Just some housekeeping there. I'm sure many of you have done a number of webinars over the last 12 months, I'm sure. But just to give you some a little bit of housekeeping here. Today's session will be 1 hour long, and we absolutely invite audience questions. So if you can use the Q&A panel within your Zoom console, we would love to receive those, and I will be badgering you for those throughout the duration of our session today to keep our speakers on their toes. This session will be recorded and we will share a link with you post-event. So if you're worried about taking lots of notes and trying to keep up with what's going on and asking questions, please don't worry about that. We will send that link to you and then you can sit and re-listen at your leisure. Now will be a really, really great time that if your browser settings are set to block pop-ups and you wish to take part in the polls that we'll be running, please change those settings now. That'd be fantastic. Thank you. So as I promised earlier, we have some fantastic speakers with some in-depth knowledge with us this afternoon. Firstly, I would like to introduce Simon Rycroft. Simon Rycroft is co-founder and director of CRMG. Afternoon, Simon.
Hello there, Simon. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Would you like to tell us just a little bit about your experience? Would be fantastic.
Yeah, sure. Yes, as Simon said, I'm a co-founder of CRMG, stands for Cyber Risk Management Group. My career in cybersecurity stretches back to 1995. Before forming CRMG, I was with PricewaterhouseCoopers for many years. I ran also the consulting practice at an organization called the Information Security Forum. In terms of CRMG, we're all about applying seasoned, experienced brains to today's cyber risk challenges, and we try to do that in as no-nonsense a way as possible.
Thanks very much, Simon. 1995, I would love to say I was still at school then. Sadly, I can't. And joining Simon today is Patrick Wheeler. Patrick is a partner and head of intellectual property and data protection at Collier Bristow. Afternoon, Patrick.
Afternoon, Simon.
Would you like to say a word or two about your experience?
Yes, of course. So as Simon has said, I'm partner and head of data protection and intellectual property at Collier Bristow. So I specialise in advice on legal and regulatory issues, in particular regarding the Data Protection Act 2018 and the UK GDPR. As some of you will know, GDPR has been around since 2018 or been in force since 2018. But as of Brexit this year, we are now working with a UK version of GDPR. So my work includes drafting and updating privacy policies and cookie notices, helping clients respond to inquiries and complaints from data subjects, including data subject access requests and the right to be forgotten, and advising on damage limitation when there's a large data breach that has occurred or when the Information Commissioner's Office report a complaint. I also help clients implement new policies and procedures, including providing training and guidance. I can help with things like data mapping and data processing impact assessments, as well as advice on transfers of data using data transfer agreements, both within the UK and internationally. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick. I mean, I guess your world professionally has seen a great number of changes over the last few years. It's a constantly shifting sands, I would imagine.
Well, yes, indeed. And I think a lot of people think that GDPR is the last word in data protection. And the truth is, actually, it's just a stepping stone. Things are going to move on from here. Oh, dear.
Well, hopefully that's to fire some questions that are going to come up shortly. Thanks very much for that, Patrick. Right, just to give everybody some context of our conversation this afternoon. And let's be honest, the world has changed significantly in the last 12 months, and not just in a professional sense. But in terms of cybersecurity and data privacy, if we look at how businesses have changed, where there's been this rush to working from home, obviously businesses have had gone into survival mode and to change their way they worked to allow them to continue. Of course, this has then prompted a great many challenges in terms of cybersecurity and data privacy. There's been a rush to innovate. So organizations have had to make these changes to try and win business from their competitors, to take on board the changing landscape that we have and change the way that people are buying, for example, and that businesses need to operate. The risks associated with the gig economy and supply chain risks is amplified. I think if we'd gone back 5 or 6 years, where we are now in many respects would be absolutely unimaginable. Data protection and cybersecurity policies have had to be ignored, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, although Simon will probably tell me off for saying that, because organizations have very much been in this survival mode, where they've had to make huge operational changes to ensure that they're still here tomorrow. And there's been obviously that the oversight that has previously been there has bled away over time. And organizations are feeling more exposed than ever, but typically fail to take a strategic approach. So again, parking strategic in need of this tactical operational approach that organizations have had to do, and quite rightly so. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor, and I'm sure some of those points there are going to resonate with some of you who are listening in today. And hopefully that will prompt you to ask some questions based on these topics. So our first poll of the afternoon, which would be great if you could respond to this. How confident are you that your business has both effective cybersecurity protection and all necessary data protection policies and procedures? We're giving you 4 options there. Very, you're effectively equipped. Quite, what we have works. You're not so sure, we need to improve, and not at all, they aren't effective and you're not equipped to manage the risks you've got there. So if you could just pick one of those options, and just waiting for those results to pop up for us now. Oh, that's quite a neat spread there in terms of a bell curve, really, isn't it? We've got to vary at 6%, then through to 6% for not at all, with many on quite. So that would suggest to me that there's most of you recognise that there are things that you need to do or would like to do to evolve in this area. Simon, would that be sort of the thing you'd expect to see? Were they kind of not surprising or not surprising?
Largely, yes. I mean, there's a sense of assurance in that result, isn't there? I mean, that organisations are broadly think they're okay, but of course there's a degree of uncertainty in there as well, and I think that honestly that reflects sentiment in the business community as a whole right now. And there will always be differing responses to that question depending on your size, your relative maturity when it comes to cybersecurity and data protection, but broadly that looks typical to me.
Yeah, I would agree, and I'd certainly welcome that as a challenge out for the 6% of you who think you're doing great stuff on this. We'd love to hear from you what you think is the thing that you're doing really, really well here. Maybe share that with the other people who've joined the call today. So, move on to our first topic, getting the basics right and understanding your current position, which I guess that question tees up quite nicely in terms of current position. So Simon, there's a question for you. What are the basics of a good cybersecurity and data protection program? And how do we avoid getting diverted by vendor hype and scare stories? So another day, another data breach story, another log into LinkedIn and have lots of people telling you, if only they'd spent X thousands of pounds on this solution, it never would have happened.
Yes, indeed.
What are the basics, Simon?
Listen, the first thing that I would say is that cybersecurity is really what we used to call information security. It's just that it's on this steroid that we all live by now called the internet. So it's still all about information, and it's about protecting the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of that information. So a fundamental step before you do anything else really is to understand what information you hold, what you use it for, how critical it is to your business success, where you hold it. And once you know that, you can start thinking about how you're going to classify and protecting it accordingly. And you'd be surprised at the number of very large organizations that really don't do any of that very well. There are some that are really quite mature, and they will undertake really comprehensive information risk assessment, and they'll really do a lot to understand the level of cyber protection that they need in line with the criticality of the information. But broadly speaking, that's a fundamental to get right. I'm sure that plays into the data protection angle that Patrick will bring to this. The other point I would make is that businesses, as you said, they can get overawed by cyber hype and scare stories. So yes, an advanced cyber program will include key elements like security governance, like secure system development, like threat and incident management, like access control, like business continuity. But the basics of a cybersecurity program are actually fairly straightforward in concept. And those basics, if you get them right, it'll take you sort of 70% of the way there in terms of what you need. And when I talk about basics, I'm talking about things like making sure that you've got a consistent process for updating all systems and devices to the latest releases of software updates so that you're protecting against known vulnerabilities, making sure that staff are changing their passwords frequently, and I'd say at least every 3 months, encouraging them not to use the same password across multiple sites. You know, if a hacker can breach the local gym and your staff members are using the same password as they are for their local gym to access corporate systems, then the hacker's got access into both. And yes, usernames and passwords are available for sale on the dark web. Keeping antivirus and malware signatures up to date, making sure you've got firewalls that are well configured in place to protect your network, making sure, it sounds basic, but making sure you've got really good backups in place that protect your operational data, that make sure that if something does happen, you can recover fast, testing your backups. Making sure you've got a single point of contact that's able to provide advice to users and then escalate if a cyber incident does occur. And I think the last point that I'd really raise when it comes to just basic fit for purpose information cyber protection is actually the role of the human being. Staff awareness is so important. Because if your staff are living in a mode where they constantly understand the threat, for example, of responding to unsolicited emails that include links to dodgy sites that are going to pinch your personal information or login credentials, then you're getting there. So that staff awareness piece is really important, and that has to be driven to the top, from the top rather. So it goes all the way to the board. If the tone from the top is set right, then it'll drip feed through the organization, and that then takes you a long way. So while none of that sounds particularly advanced, if you get the basic disciplines right, as I said, you're going to get a long way in getting a sufficient level of protection in place. And then you can then apply additional levels of protection in line with the criticality of your information, because that'll save you money while delivering the right level of protection in line with business risk.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Simon. And I don't know if it's intentional on your behalf or not. I just made a few notes as you were talking there, and actually you mentioned people, process, technology.
That wasn't intentional, actually, but
that sums it up, doesn't it? And I think I love the point there regarding assets, and I think many organisations, in my experience, see understanding assets as a really complex problem. And I recall one project I worked on where I sat down with a senior team and a whiteboard, and inside, I don't know, 45 minutes, an hour tops, we'd worked out what their information assets were, what the criticality to the business was, and it's seen as a really complex beast, and actually it doesn't have to be that complex, because you have a fairly small number of pockets of that data. And perhaps that's something you can bring in there, Patrick. Sorry, I might have stolen your thunder a little bit on that. Obviously, in terms of GDPR and DPA, Data Protection Act, knowing what your assets are is absolutely fundamentally important.
Well, absolutely, Simon. And also, the other Simon made a really good point, or several really good points, but the one I wanted to pick up on was around this being broader than just personal data. So GDPR and the Data Protection Act, of course, is concerned with personal data, which is anything that identifies a living individual. But it's information across the entirety of the business. And so that can include trade secrets, confidential information, stuff basically that gives value to your business. And the last thing you'd want is for that to leak out for your competitors to get to hear about it. So keeping that secure is obviously what every business thinks that they are focused on, but it's essential that you give that some really serious thought, that you have got the right protections in place. And GDPR is quite useful for that because it gives a structure in terms of protecting personal data, which you can apply more broadly. You can apply to your other information assets. So we've talked about what personal data is, anything that relates to a living individual. And processing, I think, sometimes catches people out. They think that you have to do something in order to process personal data, whereas in fact, any activity whatsoever, even just storing it, is a processing activity, and deleting it is a processing activity. So you need to be thinking about everything that you're doing with personal data in particular, but other data more broadly. And I think, it's having that awareness, having that understanding of how central all of this stuff is to your core business. Your core business may be selling something completely unrelated, and yet at the heart of what you're doing is all of this information, all of this data. Where GDPR is actually quite helpful, as I say, is that it specifies that you need to have appropriate technical and organizational measures in place to protect personal data. So technical, obviously, is the side that CRMG are mostly concerned with, which is, what are the things you can put in place to protect things from an IT perspective. And organizational is more the sort of policies and procedures bit, which is more my area. And the thing is, some people think that you have to spend vast amounts of money and bring in consultants to do this and that and the other. In fact, you need to have a look at your business and say, well, what's appropriate here? What's actually relevant to a business of my size doing the kind of work that I'm doing? Do I need an all bells and whistles privacy policy? Do I need huge amounts of technical gear in place? And the answer may be, actually, no, you need a pretty light touch. So it is very much a question of horses for courses, making sure you have what's appropriate for your business. But one or a couple of things you will definitely need. Sorry if I'm rambling on, do hold up your hand and stop me.
No, you keep going, Patrick, it's all good stuff.
Okay, well, a couple of things, we're talking about getting the basics right. So basics, a privacy policy. If you don't have one, you absolutely need one. I think most businesses will have one, but what I would say is, have you actually read it? Have you actually considered what that policy contains and how it applies, and how you'll know if somebody's getting it wrong? And if you haven't, I would seriously invite you to read it and just see the various things that it says. Then there'll be a cookie policy. So obviously cookies on your website, if you're doing any customer interaction through your website, you'll need a cookie policy. And then your employees, do they know what their obligations are? Do they know what they're supposed to be doing? Because a lot of the time, there might be a data protection officer or a data protection manager who's completely on top of things, and yet people further down the line who are actually doing the day-to-day activities are much less aware and much less clear on what it is they should be doing, and more importantly, what they should not be doing. And that's where the biggest vulnerability, I'm sure Simon will come on to talk about this, biggest vulnerabilities are when employees do stuff that you would think, why on earth are they doing that? People do that kind of thing. So you just have to be prepared. You have to be looking out for where those risks are coming up. And if you give people training, then you've covered your risk as best you can. You can never stop somebody doing something stupid. We all know that. But at least you can cover the risk as best you can within the capabilities of your business.
I mean, from what you said there, Patrick, before we move on to the next question, is that, and I really like it, and it's a bit that people very often forget, appropriate measures. And I think that links quite nicely into, I mean, you must have seen it several years ago. I hate to labour this point about vendor hype. So going to InfoSec several years ago, everyone wanted to sell you, which makes you GDPR compliant if you buy this bit of software, which you know was obviously a slight bending of reality anyway. But actually, it's about appropriate. And if we talk to organisations about, and I did an engagement some time ago, and the organisation said, well, we want gold standard. Well, you can have it, but it comes at a price. You don't need gold standard. Security is going to support you to run your business effectively. You're here to make a profit. And presumably that's towards your retirement or whatever it is later on. The more of you spend now will mean not necessarily is going to give you any business return. And I think that's something with GDPR. There was a lot of that activity where people were spending money because they thought they had to.
Absolutely. There were lots of scare stories about the massive fines that were going to be imposed on every business for getting it wrong. The reality is the Information Commissioner's Office said right from the word go, we're not in the business of handing out fines to businesses who might get it wrong. What we want to do is to make sure that businesses get it right. You will only get a fine if you do something so seriously badly wrong that you're going to affect and damage lots and lots of people, or if you're a large organization who frankly should know better, you've been given the opportunity to get it right and you still get it wrong. That's where the fines are going to be handed out.
I would love to talk about scare stories all afternoon because it's something that gets me quite exercised on occasion. But moving on to the second question, Simon, if I can ping this one over to you. How can SMEs assess their current cybersecurity and data privacy position effectively, taking into consideration limited resources and budget? So SMEs, by definition, they're not going to have infinite money to burn through to do this. They want to use, get the most value from what their budget. How can they assess where they are currently? So again, it's back to that honesty thing of looking in the mirror and an exception, you need a haircut. So
yeah.
Simon, how can businesses do that?
Well, there are a couple of obvious things that if I were in that position, I would aim to do. Firstly, I'd plump for a commonly accepted framework, and it doesn't really matter too much exactly what framework you choose, as long as it's got a pedigree, let's say, and there are a number out there. So, for example, ISO 27001, which is essentially the de facto ISO standard for information security. In the UK, there's a government-backed scheme called Cyber Essentials that you could take as your baseline. Also, actually, you don't have to just look to the UK. NIST, which is the US standards body for this type of thing, also have a lot of practically useful tools to help you. But essentially, take a look at a framework and understand the extent to which you're applying the disciplines described in that framework. This doesn't have to be an exhausting exercise. You just need to get to a point so that you understand in broad terms what your maturity looks like. And those frameworks will cover all the sorts of things that I was talking about just a few moments ago. They will also cover, to an extent, there will be a bit of a crossover into the world of GDPR and data protection as well. But I'm sure Patrick will cover that. So that's one thing that I would do. The advantage of doing that is it'll give you a broad sense as to what your overarching structure and approach is like in terms of whether it's fit for purpose in today's world. And the second thing that I'd do is I'd probably consider, if you are operating a customer-facing website, you will probably no doubt have a corporate network of some sort. I would probably get some sort of technical attempt commissioned to breach your own systems or site. Penetration testing is what I'm talking about, because that you can get it done periodically, because that will give you a sense as to whether there are any significant vulnerabilities that might be leaving you open to exploitation. So a couple of fairly basic things, actually, neither of which are going to take very long, but will just help you baseline where you are right now and help you form the basis for a gap assessment to help you improve over time.
Yeah, and I guess what you're saying there is denial is the worst place to be if you're not gonna look at, even if it's the ugly truth is still the ugly truth whether you've seen it or not.
Yes, The other thing I'd say, Simon, of course, is this whole concept of assessing where you are and what you're doing. It's very closely linked with, you know, ongoing compliance type of activity, and depending on the sector that you're operating in or the type of information that you're holding or processing, then you may well be subject to regulatory requirements. And of course, having this mindset of being able to assess the disciplines that you're applying and keep a check on the temperature, if you like, over time, that stands you in good stead. It also stands you in good stead if you are particularly, if you'd like to drive towards, for example, ISO 27001 certification, because that's if you go about that well, it's not just a tick in the box to say to your customers that you're okay when it comes to cybersecurity. It will genuinely help you put the right structures in place to manage cyber risk on an ongoing basis.
I'm just becoming aware of time.
Sure.
Here, but Patrick, would you like, if you one sentence you'd like to add to that question?
Well, just very briefly, I think from the organizational perspective, I've already mentioned privacy policies and cookie policies. Think also about your employees. So an employee policy, they know what their duties and obligations are. And then data mapping. That, going back to what you, Simon Lacey, were saying at the beginning, knowing what you've got. A data map is a way to do that. It's not a simple task. It might take you a little while, but it's absolutely essential to being able to manage the risk effectively. If you don't know what you've got, you can't manage the risk.
Absolutely, Patrick. That's a bit of a maxim that I try out on numerous occasions. Okay, moving on. Thanks, guys, both for those great answers. Thank you. So, poll number 2. And firstly, I'd like to say, if you've got questions for us, please fire those down. I'd love to be asking Patrick and Simon some really challenging questions from the audience here today. But poll 2. How comfortable is your business at managing the risks of remote working and spotting potential problems? Wow, this is a massive question. They're the options you should have on screen there. If you'd like to pick one of those options, certainly be interesting to see what the difference was from 12 months ago with this question. So just to give you another couple of seconds there, if you'd like to pick a choice there from the 4 that we have available for you. Thanks very much. But that, I have to say, I'm looking at that there. Pete, there's no one who said that they're not managing any risks. So I think that's a nice comfort for us this afternoon. The 24% in not so sure, you could manage risk better, quite, and 28% there is very, we're on top of it all. I think that's kind of broadly what I'd expect to see. There is a good understanding, or there is a level of understanding about information risk, and I think a lot of that was driven by GDPR implementation. So that's a really good sign there. I think if we've got 48% of people say they aren't managing any risk, that would be slightly more concerning. So thanks everybody for those responses. So move on to our second topic this afternoon. So the first question, Patrick, I think I'll go to you first here. What cybersecurity and data privacy challenges does remote working present? Hey, a whole session's only an hour this afternoon, and we need to get halfway through. But and what can we do about those challenges? We could talk about this probably for several hours on its own, Patrick.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, there's masses to say, but I mean, let's just try and focus on some of the key points. I mean, the obvious thing is lots of people working from home. It's a very different environment from where we were just over 12 months ago. A lot of people had to change quite rapidly. Not everybody was set up in the way they should be. And so perhaps some of these policies and procedures that I've been talking about either got pushed to the back of the cupboard or got forgotten about, or people weren't quite sure how they would need to adapt to them. Now, some 12 months in, I think people have got a much better handle on how things are working and where the risks are. And the poll rather reflected that most people at least felt they had a degree of confidence that you know, they were doing more or less the right things. But there are still risks out there, and those are the things we've got to keep an eye on. So things like, do your employees share workspaces? So if they're at home, do they, Do they rent a house with several other people and there's only one space effectively where people can work? Can people see what other people are doing? Can people sort of check and see what's on your screen if you leave your screen open? Do you print stuff off? Do you have hard copies lying around? Are you having a discussion? Can people overhear your telephone conversations? So all of these things are about, there's some very confidential information that your business may want to keep confidential, but actually it's being disseminated in an environment where it may not be. So those are the sort of the key things I think to keep an eye out for. We mentioned also that the biggest risk to any business is the behavior of employees. And to a large extent, when people are in an office, that behavior is predictable. You can see how people are getting on. If anybody's stressed, you can see it. If anybody's not particularly coping, it's much easier to pick it up. Working from home, those sort of stress, mental health issues are much more difficult unless you're taking an active management role. So when people are under stress, they do things that are out of character. They do things that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And that's when some really big mistakes tend to get made. So, you know, it's very important to be keeping in touch with your staff to make sure that that they're all right and that nobody's doing anything that they very obviously shouldn't be doing. And I think we're going on to talk about monitoring. Is that appropriate now, Simon, or shall I leave it?
Yeah, there's a good link there, actually, Patrick. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so there's been quite a lot of coverage recently about employee monitoring. Is it a good idea? Are there any risks associated with it? From a data protection perspective, if you're going to be monitoring your staff, you have to let them know. I mean, it's a bit like if somebody said to you, oh, by the way, I'm going to make sure that your camera's on all the time. That's okay with you, isn't it? The answer would very likely be, well, actually, no, that's not okay. You didn't tell me why. You haven't given me a good reason why. So I think explaining to staff, if you're going to be doing monitoring, explaining what monitoring you're proposing to do and making sure that it's proportionate. I think that's the key word. So don't do more stuff than you need to do. But for some businesses, it may be appropriate to have webcam monitoring. It may be appropriate to have keystroke monitoring. But for all of these things, you should be doing what's called a data processing impact assessment. So work out what are the risks, what are the implications for the privacy of individuals' data, and do a balancing act. Do you actually need to do this? Because if you don't need to do it, and if actually what you're doing for the convenience of the business is inconveniencing your employees or others, then frankly, you shouldn't be doing it. So it's very much a question of balance and a question of what's appropriate in the circumstances.
I really like that, Patrick. I think particularly the aspect that around stress, and actually that's probably something that I wouldn't necessarily have expected us to be talking about this afternoon, because it doesn't look, well, you get stress from reading policies, I guess, but that necessarily the stress there that actually the world has changed, the way we're working has changed. People may have been facilitating until recently homeschooling. You know, they've got the dog, they've got the other half is also working at home, and that's a hugely stressful environment for people to be working in. And I think organisations, it's important they acknowledge that that's part of, you know, people make mistakes when they're stressed. It's just human nature, isn't it? It's just what we do.
Simon, to add to that point, I think that, you know, the human being, you know, if you look at both cyber and data protection issues, the human being as both an asset and a source of threat and risk is massive. So we're talking about stress and human sensitivities to that. You know, there are proven techniques by which hackers and cyber criminals will exploit what we call heuristics, you know, mental shortcuts that the human being will make under stress, and exploitation of what we call cognitive bias, things like following the herd, or a tendency to do that, things like being overloaded with choices and just making a fast, easy one, things like decision fatigue. These are all known as what we call cognitive biases. And what hackers will do is they will play this out and they will predict the human response to those pressures. And it's actually very successful. And so what that means is that, there are things you can do to counteract that. You can, aside from good awareness programs, which have at their core aim making sure that people exhibit secure behavior at all times, but there are other things like secure behavior by design. If you've got an email package, Outlook, for example, well, make sure there's a button built into the toolbar so that an employee can report a phishing attack if they suspect that, so that can be escalated. Think about building in what we call nudges. When I say nudges, I mean, think of online banking. When you're going to make a payment to a payee, quite often your bank will say, do you trust this payee? Do you really want to make this transaction? And you'll think, you say, yeah, okay, I do. Well, maybe I don't. And that's what we call a nudge. It's working towards promoting secure behavior as a matter of course. So there are techniques that you can apply. There was an interesting point that Pat and Patrick raised on the monitoring issue. We talked about monitoring by camera, key logging, and so on. There's a whole area of technology now called user entity behavior analytics, UBA. And it's basically taking machine learning principles and statistical analysis and applying that to identify anomalous patterns in staff use of your organization's systems. Now, that, of course, in certain contexts could be very useful. And as Patrick said, it all has to be a balance. It has to be based on this, an evaluation between the business benefit, given the criticality of the information and the sensitivity of the information at hand, and issues around transparency and trust and culture. Really interesting stuff. So, as I said, a lot of this is about the sensitivity of the human being. And not necessarily about what we would imagine to be cyber threats. Having said that, the original question was around the challenges that we see in remote working now. I think largely the challenges were always known. It's just they've been amplified massively over the last 12 months. So just very quickly, the technology that supports remote working is under attack. So VPN, virtual private network technology, is being targeted by attackers in a way that it probably never really was so much a year ago. So that technology needs looking at and hardening and made resilient. Organizations can look at things like zero trust technology and architecture, which essentially the technology makes an assumption that nothing should be trusted, whether it's an access attempt from inside the organization or outside the organization. The point about physical security measures, I think, was very pertinent as well. The family dog is not really a very good substitute for a commercial shredder.
Well, it depends on the dog, I guess. But I think absolutely, I think that there's almost people have become, well, they were front and center previously, but even more front and center, if that is any kind of good English, of course. But actually now that we are reliant on people's behaviours at home in a way that, because you can't control people's behaviours at home in a way you can in an office. So you've got your follow me printing, or you've got, and then you've got the line manager role of saying, actually, Simon, are you okay today? You don't seem quite yourself. Can we go and grab a coffee and say, actually, I'm really stressed at the moment. This has happened at home, and I think that's things now. I, again, was talking to a friend of mine over the weekend that they do lots of virtual coffee mornings. So it's just actually to have a conversation, to talk about how things are and how things are going. We've just had a comment here from an attendee. Obviously, all the questions, all the points we'll read out will be anonymised for obvious reasons. But the attendee here says that they work for a financial services company. Oversight is paramount. From our PCs, recordable phones, and ask all our employees to turn off things like Alexa, which again, I bet a lot of organisations haven't thought about. Hey, the all listening ear of Alexa during confidential conversations. We ensure that all our employees are properly resourced with our own laptops, etc., to minimise the many risks of home working. And absolutely, again, financial services, there are lots of aspects of regulation there that are required for obvious reasons. But I think that's a great, thank you very much for that point. I think that's monitoring isn't always bad. And I think that's perhaps sometimes we need to temper those conversations. Again, Patrick used the term appropriate, which I think is fantastic for this. But thank you for that. Any other messages or questions, please fire those into us. We'd love to hear from you.
Yes, can I just pick up on that, Simon?
Of course, Patrick.
I think that's really, that's very encouraging, and I think more and more organisations are becoming more and more aware, shall we say, of the importance of managing these particular questions. But as I say, as I was saying earlier, the employees, in effect, can always be your weakest link. So you need to be thinking ahead of where a problem is going to arise. You need to be thinking, well, am I absolutely sure that my employees are completely up to date with their training, for example? Let's say that some things have changed in a policy or a procedure, or something has changed legally. Does everybody know this? Some of the people at the top of the organization probably know it very well, but do the people who are actually having to do the day-to-day implementation, are they as aware as they should be? So ongoing training, I think, is absolutely crucial. And that's much more difficult on screen. I mean, I don't know about you, but if somebody gives me a training session where I am passively sitting and listening for more than about 10 minutes, well, frankly, I'm on my iPhone. So you've got to be much more creative in the way that you deliver training. And then finally, again, something that Simon Rycroft mentioned about problems arising. If a problem arises that constitutes a data breach, you have very little time to report it to the ICO. And if you don't, then you can be, the subject of an investigation. So it's well worth your while getting this right. Are you confident that your employees know how to spot a problem and know who they need to speak to in order for that problem to be reported and then dealt with? Again, hopefully the answer to that is yes. But if it's not sure, then that's something that's definitely worth looking into.
Yeah, that's a really great point, actually. And you did mention the point there about your staff can be the weakest link. They can also be the biggest asset in terms of security and privacy too.
Absolutely.
It's that what we've talked about there is really about the culture. And of course, there's been a huge culture shift from sitting at your desk in your office with a coffee machine and your work colleagues to being, in many cases, people sat with a laptop perched on their knee, trying to help the kids with their schooling work, etc. So that's a huge change in culture there, which I would imagine that many organisations haven't been able to proactively manage, well, just because it happened so quickly. And yet a year down the line, we're probably not giving the guys at the front end all the tools they need to do things in the most secure way possible. And that's a huge challenge for organisations. Hey, we could talk about, I'm getting an orange light flashing at me here to move on to the next section. So I could probably talk about this bit for all day too, couldn't we, the three of us? Okay, moving on to section, to poll number 3. How effectively does your organisation manage cybersecurity and data protection risks in supplier and third-party relationships? Wow, this is again another large topic here. But if you just take a few moments there to respond to that poll, do you think you're on top of it? Do you think what you have works? Do you think you could perhaps manage things a bit better, or actually just you haven't thought about it yet at all? That would be great to help us add some context to our third topic this afternoon. So just give you a few more seconds there, and then we will have some results for you. Yeah, this is interesting. Once more, 8% of you feel that you're very much on top of it. Well, that's very encouraging, because it's something that's often perceived by organisations as being on the too difficult pile. 8% of you also haven't considered it at all, aren't really managing those risks. And a very even split here. We've got 42% each in the middle there, or we could manage things a bit better. Yeah, that's a really interesting set of poll results there, because it's something that's really been thrust into the spotlight over the last couple of years. Third party risk.
it's typical again, Simon. Supplier risk has, again, to an extent, it's been amplified by the pandemic. There's a lot more work being done on a sort of gig economy basis, which introduces lots and lots of small suppliers that potentially have the ability to introduce cyber risk in to your organization. And broadly speaking, if you look at any large organization, it continues to be a massive area of focus.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's our hopefully you can all see my screen there. Simon, can you see my screen? Because I've got green. Oh, excellent. My green board has disappeared. Managing third-party and supplier and cloud risks. So, Simon, a question for you to build on what you've just said there. What are the real cybersecurity and data privacy risks when it comes to third parties and suppliers? And the final part of the question, and how should we manage them?
Okay. In broad terms, there's a principle. You know, if you don't get a degree of assurance that your suppliers are as cyber secure as you are, given the circumstances of the relationship, then you're basically letting risk in by the back door. And worse, that's risk that you don't really have as much control over. So think of supplier introduced risk as the soft underbelly via which any cyber event, ransomware, phishing, denial of service, whatever it might be, or just even an accident with your supplier could in turn affect you adversely. So that's the first point. Then it stands to reason, if you accept that the bad guys might not necessarily target you because they might know that you've actually got decently robust cyber defenses. So they'll go after organizations you've got relationships with and data interchange with instead. And so that's the really big concern. There are big examples of this out there. If you are a BA customer, you'll have had an email from them recently telling you that their business partner CETA was exposed. Not to worry too much because your confidential information hasn't been disclosed, but maybe change your password anyway. Well, maybe if you're a Star Alliance customer, Leah, be a little bit more concerned because by all accounts, the interchange between CETA and Star Alliance was a bit more substantive and confidential information was exposed. And basically airlines use CETA amongst other things to manage air miles accounts and things like that. So that's just a good example of this coming into the fore. We've all heard probably about the SolarWinds attack in December in the US, where a software company, basically ostensibly, we think the Russians, compromised a software update that was being rolled out to the customers of SolarWinds, which was a software provider. And then the customers just happened to be the US government agencies and various other insignificant organizations like Microsoft. So that's another example of all this stuff going hideously wrong in terms of what you can do about it. It all comes back again to the criticality and sensitivity of information. Many organizations will issue a basic security questionnaire to their suppliers in an attempt to gain assurance that the supplier takes security seriously. But ideally, you need to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach because for many suppliers, you probably don't need anything particularly probing. It can be quite rudimentary, but for others, again, back to this concept of criticality and sensitivity and the importance of the information to the business, you might need to be a whole lot more probing in terms of what you're requiring of the supplier. So many businesses will go through what we call a triage type concept to understand which suppliers they need to be focusing on, and then requiring quite stringent security controls to be exhibited by those suppliers. And there's a linkage here with legal in that cybersecurity needs to play along nicely with procurement and legal, because things like the right to audit is very important to people in security. They want to know that they've got the facility, if necessary, to go into a supplier and actually prove that that supplier is actually practicing what they preach. But that can sometimes get redlined out by legal when it comes to the hard end of negotiations. So security needs to interface nicely with legal to make sure that legal understands what levels of control are required, why those levels of control are required, and what can and can't be negotiated away.
I think that's, before I come to Patrick on that, I think that's a really good point. about one size fits all. I think there is very often a temptation for organizations to say, let's throw the kitchen sink at this. And then you find you're applying the same assessment process for your stationary supplies as for your critical software, as to your storage of your IP. And of course, what happens then is your security team just gets driven down. You look at procurement processes that last months and months and months.
You're going to access a lot of suppliers as well. if you take
some big organizations might be onboarding hundreds of suppliers a month, which means you're never going to have enough resource to manage that. It's a case of focusing your efforts and your resource on the things that matter most to you, i.e. the things that will make you break out in a cold sweat at 2 o'clock in the morning, not your stationary supplier and your paper clips. And also, of course, when we talk about the third party, it's also not just your supplier. It might be their supply chain, because they might outsource very key aspects of what you're procuring. Patrick, I think you could really add something to this in terms of the privacy risks here too.
Yes, well, thank you. And again, just to pick up on something that Simon Rycroft was saying, that if you don't check out, if you don't make sure that your suppliers of critical services apply at least the same levels of security and diligence that you do, you are frankly just opening yourself up to a whole heap of trouble. There was a news report just this morning about a company that manages security cameras for some really, really big organizations, and they were hacked. And so security footage, obviously very confidential, clearly personal data, for all of these organizations had been available to the hackers. So those companies themselves may have had perfectly good security, but their supplier didn't have adequate security, and that's the issue. So you need to be doing your due diligence. Sometimes you need to be holding out when they say, this is our standard contract, we don't add additional warranties, we never guarantee this, we never provide assurance on that. Well, frankly, there are lots of people providing similar services. If you don't get what you want from one, there's generally another one out there. So
well, it's back to that point. Sorry, Patrick. It's back to that point, really, isn't it? You can outsource services and supplies, but you can't outsource your risk.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think from the contractual side, you just need to be clear what it is you're talking about. So, I mean, going back to absolute basics, who is the data controller? Who is the person who's actually gathering the data and exercising the decisions as to what's going to happen to that data? Who is the data processor, the one who is carrying out the instructions of the controller? And how is it appropriate to apportion risk and liability dangers between them? And that's the purpose of a contract, essentially, is it's balancing of risk, balancing of liability.
And I suspect, Patrick, though, there's a huge number of organizations there that are reliant on legacy contracts, because it's a contract they signed 10, 15, perhaps more years ago. Great relationship with the supplier. Everyone gets on really well. But of course, things have changed, and now your supplier is using cloud, et cetera, and the contract is no longer robust, has got holes in it, because it's just, things have just moved on.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's a very good point, that sometimes people say, oh, well, we've had a perfectly good relationship, everything's worked fine. Well, yeah, everything tends to work fine until there's a problem. And then you have a look at the contract to find out what the contract says. And quite often, it doesn't say what you think it says, or what you remember it saying. So these are the sorts of things you really need to be clear on. And yes, refreshing contracts, because the technology is changing year on year. So if your contract's 5 years old, you almost certainly need to have another look at it. And I mean, in terms of exchanging data with the US, for some time, there's been a compromise in place so far as personal data is concerned. There was the privacy shield, but that's gone now as a result of a court case called Schrems. That's no longer there. So if you are exchanging data with the US, you need to have a specific contract which sets out what your risk management procedures are in what's called standard contractual clauses. And you need not just to put a standard clause, you need to adapt those standard clauses to your specific requirements. there's quite a lot of work involved in transferring data from one jurisdiction to another, and if you try and take shortcuts, that's where you can start hitting problems.
And I think with small, medium-sized enterprises, I think there's almost that temptation that you're so invested with your supply chain and your third parties, because changing is difficult, expensive, disruption across all services. Actually, that sometimes having those mature, healthy relationship conversations with your suppliers can actually become quite difficult, because you feel that you're in quite a defensive position, and that you can't actually, because you know it's so hard for you to move, and of course your supplier might know it's hard for you to move, but it becomes almost an unbalanced relationship. Is that something you see at all? Well, Patrick or Simon, for that matter, is that something you've seen previously?
Well, I mean, certainly contracts with big cloud suppliers, that they tend to be on very, very standard terms. There's no negotiation on the terms there. So if you're not happy with the terms your cloud provider sets out, then your only option really is to look for another cloud provider. So there is well, I suppose it's true in all contractual negotiations. The bigger the organization, the less your own individual bargaining power.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, you could argue that cloud services are no different from any other supplier, but they are in reality, because of exactly that you've outlined there, Patrick. This disparity in bargaining power, basically between the two organisations. Having said that, you still need to ensure that information is being protected in line with its requirements to be protected. So there are slightly different tactics, if you like, that you might need to think about when it comes to cloud suppliers. Firstly, they are open to dialogue in some instances. Secondly, if that's not directly possible, you can get publicly available information that will give you a degree of assurance that the supplier is as secure as they need to be. They may well be able to provide attestation or certification information, for example, an ISO 27001 certification. You have to be careful about that, because these certifications always have a scope aligned with them, and you just need to make sure that they've certified the product that you're buying and not their office, for example. And also there is this concept of what we call OSINT, open source intelligence, which again is publicly available information that enables you to work out whether there might be vulnerabilities in your supplier's technical arrangements that you really ought to know about. And then the other thing to just bear in mind is that there is the potential to have a degree of control directly yourself over security configurations in cloud services, depending on what those services are. So for example, you have software as a service, for example, Office 365. You've got platform as a service, which might be database technologies or software development technologies available in the cloud. And then you've got infrastructure as a service, which might be virtual servers and networking and all that sort of stuff. And broadly, your ability to control security configurations in those services extends and increases as you go from software through to platform through to infrastructure.
I'm sorry, Simon, I'm going to cut across you there because we're rapidly running out of time. Yeah. Let's do another session on cloud at some point, if you two guys are up for that. We've also had a couple of questions in. Unfortunately, we've been beaten by time here, and apologies. I think we could have gone on for much longer here. So, guys, I'll start with you, Simon. In one sentence, what's your one takeaway that people should go away and think about as a result of this 1 hour of their time they've given up today?
Don't try to boil the ocean. It's very clear. I mean, you will never be able to protect everything to exactly the same degree. You will go bust, I can guarantee it. So pick an approach that's right for you now. And that might not be the same as where you're going in the future. And if you'd like to talk to us on a complimentary basis, we would be very happy to spend a little bit of time with you and to give you an indication as to where we think you are and broadly what a roadmap for improvement might look like.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Simon. And Patrick, same with you. One sentence. What should people go away and do now as a result of all these things we've talked about?
Well, I think the biggest risk for SMEs is a lack of knowledge or a lack of awareness of data privacy risks. So if you're not feeling entirely confident about where your business is, whether they're doing the right things or not, it's well worth having a chat with somebody. And both Simon and I are offering, no commitment chat. We can talk through some of your major issues. And if as a result of that, you decide things need to be done, well, fine, we can take it from there. But yeah, just raise the awareness, I think, is the key takeaway.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Simon, Patrick. That's I would love to have chatted longer today. Thank you also to the audience today. Thank you for those who've given up an hour of your day. With a couple of questions and points have been raised here that we haven't had time to talk about, but we'll deal with that separately in an email our post-event. We will be sending a link down to you so that you can re-listen here if there's anything, because we covered quite a lot of ground here. But beyond that, I'll just like to say thank you very much, everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon. And thanks for your time. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye, Rob.
Bye-bye.